Today on Inside the Issues, I talk with Ernie Regehr on civil society and peace advocacy. Hello and welcome to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. I'm David Welch, the CG Chair of Global Security at the Balsillie School of International Affairs. Every week we talk to a noted expert on some aspect of global governance here from the studios at the Center for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo, Ontario. And I'm very pleased to welcome to the studio today Ernie Regehr, who's a distinguished practitioner as well as theorist of peace advocacy, co-founder of Project Ploughshares way back in 1976, and currently research fellow at the Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies at Conrad Grebel University College here at the University of Waterloo. So welcome.
Pleasure.
Let's talk a bit about your background. Of course, you are a recipient of the Order of Canada for your work with Project Ploughshares. So obviously internationally recognized contribution. How did this start? What initially led you into a career in peace advocacy?
Well, my family and I spent a few years in Africa, in southern Africa, back in the early 1970s. At the same time, I had done a book on Canadian military exports, and in southern Africa, we were in Zambia and in Botswana, a little bit of time in South Africa. But in Zambia, Botswana, Tanzania, these were the newly emerging independent countries at that point, and they were all very busily accumulating significant military establishments. I mean, that's one of the measures of a newly independent country. You got to have your own airlines and a military. And so they were buying fighter aircraft and tanks and all of that kind of thing. Well, and to anybody who was there, you knew that the long-term security of people, the viability of that state, was going to depend on the extent to which there was economic development, basic health needs were met, education was available, those kinds of things. And so it just seemed, it was incongruous to see the amount of money that was being spent on buying military equipment against an enemy which didn't exist. I mean, no one was threatening them with fighter aircraft or tanks. And it just seemed this kind of fundamental misuse of resources and a fundamental misunderstanding of what the basis of security was for those societies and the individuals of those societies. And so I'd already had an interest in military export and the international arms trade. And so kind of put those together when we came back to Canada. Then it seemed better than looking for a job was to simply to continue on that work. And so I did some research assignment and gradually developed it into an NGO that was dedicated to beating those swords into plowshares.
Right. And was Canada a significant player in Africa at that time?
I mean, it was a significant sort of third-tier player, I would say. It was significant in things like the supporting education, supporting teachers who were working there. It was a significant player in Botswana. We had a significant program, both in Zambia. We were also a player at that level in the sale of military commodities to Africa at about the same time.
And how did you imagine that Plowshares would actually contribute to this goal? Would it be through consciousness raising, naming and shaming, coming up with creative policy ideas for governments, some combination of those or something else?
I would say a combination of those. I mean, we were initially focused on Canadian policy, and that was the expectation that what you needed to do was to influence Canadian policy on these issues, so it was policy oriented and policy change oriented. I never really conceived it so much as a popular education vehicle, although we've certainly done, or Plowshares has certainly done that over the years and contributed to policy development within civil society and that sort of thing. But I think policy change at the official level, and then gradually over the years you recognize, well, Canada, focusing on Canadian policy alone isn't really has limitations. So then more engagement at the UN level and at an international level, more cooperation with civil society internationally.
Right. 76 was fairly early in terms of the era of civil society activism. Most people, I think, back then would have thought if we need to change governmental policy, the way to do it is to work through the government, or get into positions in the bureaucracy or office. But you seem to have understood that there was an advantage to working from outside the government. How did you see that advantage? What was your particular ability or effectiveness that you didn't imagine you could accomplish through an official channel?
Well, I think that there was just a sense that working through official channels was going to be it was going to be very, very narrow, and I came to these issues from kind of a broad values-based approach to these questions. So I mean, I think we had modest expectations as to the impact that one could have over the long term, but I think that there was a feeling that access to government, access to legislators, and engaging policymakers in discussion was a way in which you could have an impact. I mean, I think you're right that the climate in that era was not welcoming of that. I mean, officials, particularly in foreign affairs, thought that weighty issues of national security and diplomacy were more properly left with them, and we shouldn't really bother ourselves about that too much. And so there was I would say there was a fairly strong condescending attitude towards
initial resistance.
And that's right. And but that's one of the things that has changed dramatically over the years, and that is the recognition by governments that engagement with civil society enhances their own work and understanding, and isn't just dealing with troublemakers.
Right. Well, let's explore that a bit more in a minute when we come back. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. Ernie, let's continue talking about the change in the climate for civil society peace advocacy. You were with Plowshares for more than 30 years.
Right.
So during that time, how did Plowshares change, and how did the audience change?
Well, I think one of the ways in which we changed and which civil society had changed is that really began with a very strong sense of being outsiders to the policy process. We were kind of outsiders trying to get in, and then I mean it had the character of more the character of a protest movement. I mean the level of trust and understanding between civil society and officials was not great, and you really felt yourself up against someone, and officials, I mean, tended to view you as that. But I think so that's a big change. Then right now the strategy is not as a protest movement. I mean, you don't sit outside, do your policy research, develop the answer, and then go and try and sell it to government. Now you understand that the way in which you bring change is engagement with officials. You try to understand the conundrums, the difficulties that officials themselves face in the policies that they face, and it's engagement with them that produces some change. I mean, you bring a perspective to the table. You bring a set of values and a set of priorities and preferences, obviously, to that debate, but you understand yourself as being in a debate. And if it's a genuine debate, both sides are going to be altered by it. Mm-hmm. And so that the ones who are trying to influence change are altered, and I think, I mean, the pejorative term is selling out. I think the more constructive term is understanding the difficulties that policymakers are facing, and getting a better understanding of the way in which nuance can be constructive.
And policymakers were generally more receptive. At some point, they stopped being so condescending and began being more welcoming.
I mean, it's definitely a gradual process, I would say.
With ups and downs, I imagine.
With that, and I mean, there are different policy makers, and I mean, I mean, one of my early interlocutors in the Department of Foreign Affairs related to our military exports, I mean, said to me that you ought to go home and find a useful thing to do with your life at some point.
Very dismissive.
And whereas others were very engaging and welcoming and so forth. So that you know, you can't blanket them all, but gradually there is an understanding of civil society, and gradually it came to formally include civil society in consultations, and I've served on delegations of the Canadian Department of Foreign Affairs to a number of arms control forums, for example, which is a reflection of that.
How do you explain this? How do you explain the change on the official side?
I think part of it, the change came at the end of the Cold War, and I think that officials, the same as civil society, were disoriented by those whole developments. I mean, we faced a whole new set of issues which were increasingly defined as peace building. What are the conditions that need to be obtained in order for there to be durable and stable societies and peace? And I think there's gradually a sense that none of us know how to do it all that well. I mean, we've been doing development and this kind of work for a long time, but there are a lot of troubled societies out there, and I think that there's part of this understanding that this is a mutual conundrums that we're facing.
Is it a commentary on the constraints that governments are facing, that they don't have enough people, they don't have enough resources internally to do what they have to do, and they have to reach out?
I think that's true. I think that they do, and it isn't. I mean, I don't. In some ways, it's the nature of the institution. You could put a lot more resources into it, and they still wouldn't have the links to civil society in African countries, for example, where development workers work, and who work in rural communities, and where teachers are, and understand the society, and get access to a society in a way in which diplomats don't get access to it. So part of it is structural. Part of it certainly is resources, I think.
Mm-hmm. Now, a lot of people would say that peace advocacy in particular it's in the realm of high politics. So it's the sphere in which governments would be most jealous of their prerogatives and autonomy. Is it the case that civil society actors are being welcomed still by officials, specifically in peace advocacy work? Or are most civil society actors who are effective with governments working in the so-called low politics issues of food and energy and development and women's issues? Is it an easy sell now, even with sort of defense and foreign policy related issues?
Well, I think you're right that the most immediate issues, I mean, and in Canada, the development community has been the most advanced in developing a sense of professionalism, and in which it contributes to policy development. Human rights as well. I think in the peace advocacy, that's a longer term development. I think that in areas like nuclear disarmament, for example, I mean, we've seen a major change in public attitudes, governmental attitudes, and the way in which the objective of a world without nuclear weapons is now defined from everyone from Kissinger to the peaceniks. So I think that the civil society was an important element of that transformation that took place. I mean, conditions changed. The end of the Cold War came and so forth. But I think that I think that the influence is there at these grander levels.
Some of the NGOs who are very effective internationally leverage nonpartisanship or neutrality. Mm-hmm. Thinking, for example, of Doctors Without Borders and the Red Cross. Right. So they sell themselves to governments in part because they're nonpartisan. Yeah. Is that harder to do if you're a peace advocacy group? Is that sort of inherently thought of by governments as a partisan thing?
I mean, I think it's more difficult. I mean, we certainly have tried, and Canadian civil society generally, I think, has tried quite hard to be nonpartisan in it. I mean, to the annoyance of some of the parties who more readily adopt the policies that we advocate. But I think that, and so that our relationship in the advocacy has tended to concentrate a bit more on officials, parliamentarians through committees and that sort of thing. And so I think that there is a I don't think that we're painted as being advocates or in kind of stealth advocates for a particular political party. I think there's a recognition of that.
Good. Well, we'll be right back with Ernie Regehr to talk more about peace advocacy and civil society. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. Ernie, we were talking a bit about the end of the Cold War, and we were talking about nuclear activism. And I may be wrong, but my impression was that it was really the early 1980s, the early Reagan years, when there was general panic about the imminent danger of nuclear war, that civil society became all of a sudden very well organized, specifically on nuclear issues. Was that a turning point in sort of the level of activity among peace advocates and their attempts to engage governments?
It was indeed, and it really started in 78. There was a special session on disarmament at the United Nations General Assembly, and there was a lot of civil society organizing for participating in that session at the UN in New York, and that was also the time of the Reagan-Carter, as I recall, presidential campaign. And Ronald Reagan was making had a much more of a belligerent stance. This was the pre-Reykjavik Ronald Reagan, but he had this very, very strong sense. And you had Alexander Haig talking about firing a nuclear missile across the bow to get somebody's attention. It was brazen talk about nuclear war fighting, which was introduced into the environment then. And so, and that really came to a head in the early 1980s, 1982, in that era, where there were large demonstrations around the cities of Europe and New York and in Canada as well. So that was an era of great activism, and very interestingly, in Canada, for example, a significant number of civil society organizations grew up and raised a lot of money and became very active in nuclear disarmament. That was a level of activity and a level of funding that was very difficult to sustain, and some did and some didn't.
Levels of anxiety globally about nuclear war dropped off dramatically when the Soviet Union collapsed. And of course, we still live in a world in which there are thousands of nuclear weapons and relatively new nuclear-armed countries, North Korea, Pakistan, India. So probably we shouldn't relax quite as much as we seem to have done at the end of the Cold War. What is civil society doing now? What are peace advocacy groups doing to try to prevent nuclear issues from falling off the table entirely?
Well, some of the issues are related specifically to the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and the Review Conference. There was one in 2010, and advocacy around things like getting ratification of the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. It's long been on the agenda of the disarmament officials to get a fissile materials cutoff treaty started, and that's held up. So some of the advocacy is done directed at those fairly specific things. For example, de-alerting the nuclear weapons that are still deployed. What's the point in this era of having these weapons ready to fire off on 15-20 minutes notice when there's a huge possibility that it could be a false alarm that sets them going? So it's advocacy on some of those things. Then more broadly, and in Canada, which doesn't have weapons to de-alert and doesn't test weapons, so it doesn't have that immediate stake in. But here we try to mobilize some Canadian support for taking the broad disarmament agenda further, and a lot of the discussion now is around a nuclear weapons convention, which was advocated by the Secretary General, which was given a kind of quasi-support at the Non-Proliferation Treaty in 2010, and which is viewed by civil society as creating a kind of framework within which the whole array of nuclear disarmament issues that need to be addressed can be brought together and rationalized, and significantly start to give some timelines towards meeting objectives.
In addition to nuclear issues, what are some of the other issues that you personally consider especially urgent, that should be the focus of attention among peace advocates?
Well, I think one of the very difficult things that we're facing is that we see in Afghanistan and Libya, and that is to try to make sense out of the basic commitment to come to the protection of vulnerable people through responsibility to protect, and actually developing the means of doing that without simply making conflicts more difficult and escalating violence in them. I think a critical attention to the ways in which the resort to force has utility, and the ways in which the resort to force in international settings has the opposite. Actually does more harm than it does good. Libya, I think, is not a bad example of that, in which the international community responded in reasonable time to the threat of major increased violence against civilians. Already there were attacks on civilians, and there was a prospect, as the Gaddafi forces were about to enter into Benghazi, I think is the town, that this would escalate, and you face the prospect of the international community sitting back on its hands while people were being slaughtered in a city. And so there was a response to that, and that particular slaughter was prevented, but it was a quick response without enough time to say, now what? I mean, how do we've done that. The international community from aircraft high up cannot prevent attacks on civilians in urban centers. So I think that that's a very big challenge that the international community faces, that I think civil society needs to address itself to as well, and that is, what are the ways in which you can make the responsibility to protect vulnerable people real, without simply adding to the problems in the longer run.
And as you know, among peace advocate groups, some come out of a faith tradition which is inherently pacifistic, and,
Right.
and others don't.
Right. Mm-hmm.
Now, is there a tension within peace advocacy groups about the modalities? And many people would say the only way to prevent civilians from being slaughtered in Benghazi was to, in effect, go to war against Libyan forces controlled by Muammar Gaddafi.
Oh, I mean, it's a very difficult problem, and I feel it particularly because I'm from one of those faith traditions that is pacifist, and so that come to it with a very acute wariness of military force and what it can and can't do, and a lot of skepticism about it, what can accomplish. But I think that where I come at it is a bit. It's a bit of a parallel to domestic policing. I mean, the way in which you prevent domestic violence, for example, in the long run, is through a whole range of social and economic programs and education. But when prevention fails, then there are times when you've got to call the police in to protect vulnerable people, and that's kind of the situation internationally. The problem is that internationally, we're way behind in doing the preventive work effectively. And I think that's where the greatest attention needs to be.
Well, we'll come back and chat about that in a moment. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. Let's talk about one of the issues that's, of course, been preoccupying Canadians for a while, and that is our role in Afghanistan. Not just our role, but the international community's role in Afghanistan. Is your view that we're actually making a contribution there to solving the deeper issues you've just identified as important for solving if we're going to prevent civil conflict, or are we actually making it worse?
Well, I think the evidence suggests the latter. I mean, I think that, which doesn't lead me to conclude that we need to get out immediately, but I think that I mean, it was from my point of view, it was the wrong way to try to deal with the Taliban in the first place. I mean, if you visit Kabul and talk to civil society people there, for example, I mean, they're very strong on the gains that they've made since the ouster of the Taliban, so that there are elements of Afghan society that have benefited enormously and made genuine gains in for example, the way in which women are treated in urban centers and so forth. Those are significant things. But hard to argue that 10 years, 11 years now, is it, since the initial invasion, 10 years since the initial invasion, that it's become a better place, and it's better for Afghans generally. I think that the problem is that what would happen if the international community were to pick up and leave. The last time the international community picked up and left after the ouster of the Soviets, Afghanistan descended into a major civil war. And if you go around Kabul now and see the buildings that are destroyed, that's when they were destroyed. They weren't destroyed by the war against the Soviets. They weren't destroyed in the current war. They were destroyed in that civil war. And the big danger is that unresolved civil war will return with a vengeance. The international community has a capacity to prevent that civil war. What it doesn't have the capacity for is to provide security and safety for people in their homes in the current situation. So you've got a very big conundrum there, I think.
Is the lesser evil for the international community to stay there, more or less indefinitely?
It surely can't be indefinitely. I think that I actually think that the policy that the Obama administration has advanced is a sensible one, and that is to give timelines. Say, okay, 2014 we start pulling out. I mean, whether it should be 2014 or 2012, you can debate that. But I think a strong signal that one, the international community is going to pull out, and that places high urgency on the issue of diplomacy and reconciliation between the parties to that civil conflict that is in danger of breaking out into unrestrained war. And so you've got to talk to the Taliban, all of the insurgent communities. There have to be compromises made. Some of the compromises are going to be ugly and contrary to human rights values and so forth. But there needs to be the pursuit of a ceasefire and some reasonable way of building some stability into that society. We can't train enough Afghans for them to carry on war without end. I mean, the solution can't be to turn the war over to the Afghans.
If you had the opportunity to identify key areas where Canada should be focusing its contribution to global peace, where would you point now? We had some success with landmines. For a while it looked like we were going to take small arms very seriously. That didn't work out as well as the landmines did. Something else, human security has more or less fallen off the current government's agenda. Where should we refocus?
Well, I'm more familiar with arms-controlled kinds of issues, and there's an arms trade treaty being negotiated now. Nuclear issues are on the agenda. None of these are high priority issues in international discourse at the time, but they're all essential and important issues, and they're areas in which Canada can make an important contribution. I think that is from the point of view of human security and preventive action. I think it's a very big mistake to reduce the emphasis on Africa. I think there's a great deal that still needs to be done there. There's a great deal of opportunity there, and there's a lot of African societies that are stable and beginning to develop, and the economy is beginning to prosper. Look at Mozambique, for example, is a good example. Botswana, Namibia, these are all areas. I think those developments need to be supported and advanced in much more actively. It's not just a matter of increasing aid, it's a matter of agricultural subsidies, as you know, and those kinds of issues. So I think engagement with Africa ought to continue to be or restored as a priority.
Still a very full agenda.
It is indeed.
Well, thank you very much, Ernie, for coming in and spending time sharing your insights and your experiences with us.
My pleasure.
Very grateful to you. And for our audience, we hope to see you again next week at another episode of Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. You can find our complete collection of episodes at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on YouTube, and on Twitter.